to the second pillar of the tripod of the theme of the conference, democracy, development, democracy, and social policy. And we will be looking at, we have three speakers, Anna, Michael, and Dennis. Anna is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bremen in Germany. For her PhD, she studied the state formation effects of social policy in Zambia, but she's also interested in Southern African region as a whole. Currently, she's looking more closely at rural economic transformation, food and land policy, as well as the process of knowledge production in the global social policy. She's also affiliated with the University of Zambia as a visiting researcher and is currently based in Lusaka until the end of the year. Michael is currently a senior research fellow with the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, Legon. His research interests include social policy governance and the interface between domestic politics and activities of transnational policy actors. Between 2013 and 2017, he was a policy advisor in the Office of the President of the Republic of Ghana, with dual responsibility as the Executive Director of the Ghana National Service Scheme. Dr. Professor White is currently a co-principal investigator in a Pan-African research project, Gender Equitable and Transformative Social Policy in Post-COVID Africa, post-COVID Africa. I will post in the chat section later, link to his works. Dennis is currently Professor of Sociology, Eastern Connecticut State University. And I need to commend Dennis especially because he's been up since 1 a.m. to join the session, being 7 hours behind to join the conference, and the same thing yesterday. Happily, he said today he doesn't have any teaching session. And publishes on development issues, including Caribbean development in the multipolar world order, a 2022 book that will be issued by Routledge. Neoliberal democratization and new authoritarianism, Routledge reprint, which was released in 2019. New extractivism and the capitalist developments, released by Routledge in 2018. Capital accumulation and migration, Haymaker in 2014. And the European bloc imperialism, Haymaker in 2012. He won the Connecticut State University 2009 System-Wide Research Award, served as commissioner on the State of the Connecticut African American Affairs Commission, and was visiting professor Institute for Development Studies and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, University of Cape Coast, Ghana. So we'll go in the order in which they appear in the program. Anna, you have 20 minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Jimmy, for the introductions, and thank you to everyone who's organizing this great conference for giving me the opportunity to share some of my ideas. I feel very honored. Yeah. Okay. With my presentation, and please interrupt in case you can't see it, otherwise I'll just proceed. With my presentation, I think I'm picking up two issues that were raised, well, numerous times in the past 1.5 days. And these are, first of all, the role of the state, the responsibility and the tasks that the state faces within social policy, and also the kind of image of the state that's partly guiding social policy design. And then the other question, or the other issue, is this question of how neoliberal are many of the social policies that we currently see on the continent. And my research focus tries to combine these two under one overall research question, and that is, how is the state being reconstituted after retrenchment? And of course, one of the things we might want to discuss, and that I'll also discuss a little bit later, is this question of whether actually we are finding ourselves in the period after retrenchment or not, maybe much more in the middle of it. Yes, but anyway, so this is mainly based on my PhD research, which I completed early last year. And then so most of what I'll present today is basically some of the main findings from my PhD research. But then I'm also sneaking in somewhat of a new and ongoing research idea. So there's two overall parts. Yeah, so basically my main argument is that social policy is a site for the, well, that's actually not the main argument, sorry. I've changed this presentation back and forth so many times. So this is the starting point for my research, and that is that social policy constitutes one important site and a key site for deriving an empirically grounded understanding of the state in the present era. And this really follows, dissatisfaction with a lot of the, at least political science, but I think wider literature about states in Africa and African contexts, that I think is often very unnuanced and not very helpful. So I've chosen social policy as a place or as a site, as a field for deriving a bit more of a nuanced and empirically grounded understanding of the state. Yes, so, and then basically the main argument that follows is that state formation actually happens in social policy, and that state formation is an ongoing process. But even though it's ongoing and it's never completed nowhere in the world, this is an especially important process after the period of structural adjustment. And from my point of view, and as I think I haven't mentioned, but you might have picked this up from the title page, this is all based now on the Zambian context. And from my point of view, state formation and social policy essentially consists of a connection between what has for a long time been really an entrenched disconnect between the center and the periphery. And I'll speak more about how I think these two are being bridged within social policy. But while we do see many of these mechanisms at play, mechanisms of state formation, I've also found that this is really a bit of an ambiguous dynamic because of the entrenchment, or because of the, well, basically the accepted facts that neoliberalism comes with. So I would almost call this a dialectic dynamic. So we have, on the one hand, a movement by which the state is expanding into peripheral areas. So it's expanding in scope and in knowledge and so on and so forth. And I'll show what I mean. So it's clearly reappearing in a way. But at the same time, on the other hand, the accepted limits of what the state should do and can do are actually further strengthened in the process. So this is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. So I've covered the question and the argument. I'll give just a very brief background to what I mean by center-periphery divide in the Zambian context. And then I'll briefly introduce the two main social policy programs that I have studied, well knowing that there are many, many more. Then I'll quite selectively present some of those mechanisms I'm talking about, mechanisms of state formation. And then, as I said, also bring in, an idea that basically came out of this research, but has to be taken much further. And that's one of the things I'm currently planning to do while being back in Zambia after 3 years of not being here, finally. Right, so from my point of view, center-periphery divide is really a colonial legacy. So it's essentially an economic, the main dimension of it really is economic, I would say. So all sorts, or most industrial and other types of economic activity are concentrated along the so-called line of rail. So a relatively thin stretch in the middle of the country. And from this also results the fact that there's these very high levels of informality and very high levels of rural-urban inequality. But I don't only see center-periphery as being basically an urban-rural divide, but also, you know, within rural areas and within urban areas, you have really a divide between those that are connected and those that are not connected. Of course, this also leads to low levels of social security coverage, in particular social insurance coverage, because of the low levels of formal employment. It also translates into a dire lack of political voice for many people and visibility in the centers. And even though these, well, colonial legacies have, of course, been attempted to be overcome, by numerous governments, and well, most purposefully or most explicitly, I would say, by the post-independence government of Kenneth Kaunda. Really, all these social questions that result from this disconnect, from this divide, have basically remained unsolved to the present day. Now, in the early 2000s, two new programs were introduced in Zambia, and you've probably come across them, definitely if you've listened to Andrew Fisher's presentation yesterday. So one of them is the social cash transfer, a quite classically donor-initiated program, which has, however, over time been taken up by the Ministry of Community Development itself, and has been considerably scaled up from initially being just, you know, like a small pilot project. Sorry, I was interrupted by some notice I didn't understand. Okay, and this is a social assistance program. So, you know, people receive cash on a bi-monthly basis, and it's targeted at what they call vulnerable households that fall into one of 5 categories, such as, for example, the elderly, or people with disabilities, or female-headed households, and so on. On the other hand, we have the Farmer Input Support Program, or FISIP, which was initiated at the same time, but was from the beginning a state-initiated program. So it falls under the Ministry of Agriculture, and it basically provides seed and fertilizer to smallholders. Very much in contrast to the cash transfer, FISIP has always been very controversial, and especially so in the last, let's say, 10 years. There has been, well, mounting criticism of the program for many reasons. And this eventually led to a considerable reform of the program that has been ongoing since 2016, where the number of recipients was reduced, and then also the direct supply of inputs through the state was at least partly replaced with an electronic voucher. Right, so the question is, how are these programs contributing to state formation, if they are? And now I've just singled out what I think are 3 of the main mechanisms. The first one I would call I would call discursive inclusion. So what I've conceptualized as, you know, bridging center and periphery happens on the discursive level. Yet this, of course, matters materially, because what's debated in discourse and what's expressed in official narratives obviously has very strong effects for what actually then becomes possible to do, right? So in Zambia, for instance, we have the Vision 2030, and also the development plans have reappeared after the turn of the millennium. And in all of these documents, and I've not just analyzed documents, but I have talked to numerous officers on all levels of the state, you constantly find this really acknowledgement of the need for government to look after the people. And there's this expressed aim to distribute wealth and to reconnect some of those peripheral areas in a way, or to reduce poverty, you could also say. But it's not only framed under poverty reduction. But even though we have this growing discursive inclusion, also at the level of the discourse, you have a clear, well, definition of responsibilities. And I would hold that at least to some extent, well, to quite a large extent, the responsibility for not only individual betterment, improvement, but also for national development is actually shifted to the recipients of social policies. This happens, for example, by well, more or less implicitly, sometimes quite explicitly, making clear that people are ultimately the ones to blame for the poverty that they are in. So I really like this one expression by an official in the Ministry of Agriculture who said that people have to graduate from humanism. Now, graduation is this term that's always used in policy speak for people to exit a program after a certain number of years. And then humanism obviously being Kenneth Kaunda's ideology. So a widespread perception is that people have become too used to what they say generous social policies implemented by Kaunda. Of course, that's a whole other debate, whether they were so generous after all. So there's this constant emphasis on people having to change their mindset. So almost like they are still in the middle of the transition to capitalism, you might even say. There's also this claim that people have to wake up. So the whole nation has to wake up, but especially also the individual people, to finally make use of all these abundant resources that are there. And then the other way in which I would say the kind of the limits of the state are being built into these new social policies is that actually the means, what I've called the means, are determining the vision. So, for example, the so-called targeting criteria, so the eligibility criteria in the social cash transfer, even though you have all these really logical explanations as for why some people might be more in need of support than others, actually what many people have explained to me, this targeting itself follows from the fact that the state just simply doesn't have enough money to look after everyone. So there's usually this kind of estimation of how much money is there, and then based on that and based on the living conditions monitoring survey, it is estimated and calculated what should be the targeting criteria, right? So it's like a reverse logic of distributing or of targeting social policies. And then similarly in the FISIP program, there's this need for graduation. So for farmers to leave the program after, I think it's currently 3 years, I mean, in theory at least. And this also has been explained to me by the need to make space for others because they don't have enough money to look after everyone that would need FISIP, right? So farmers have to leave the program to make room. All the while stressing that these 3 years should be sufficient to kickstart farmers and to, transform them into self-sufficient business people. So I would say that, because of this mismatch between official discourse and then the kind of quite simple budget reasons, the limits of the state are being further, cemented. Maybe less interesting, if the previous one was interesting at all, but maybe less surprising. Of course, social policy, if you put resources in place, can contribute to bureaucratic reach. So it was really obvious during all my field research that really the low local state capacity seems to be the binding constraint for the implementation of existing programs. But it's not only that officers obviously need vehicles and fuel to go to remote places, but also that these more material resources enable officers to project what I would call, or let's say what Bourdieu and others would call, bureaucratic rule. So standardizing society, for instance, based on some criteria that the state has thought out at the center. This projection of bureaucratic rule is also taking place through tapping into volunteer structures. So even though we might think that having non-state actors helping with the implementation of social policy, I wouldn't necessarily say that this cannot also contribute to state formation in the sense that these volunteer committees, they really implement the guidelines and the criteria that are devised in the ministry. If they are guided well, and if if there's enough oversight, which at least in the period of my field research was the case. Very much in contrast to that, FISIP, while it is also de facto administered by non-state actors, namely the farming cooperatives, even though they are not officially mandated to administer FISIP, but they basically end up having to make the key decisions because there's just not enough local state capacity in the form of extension officers and so on. So in FISIP, you do not find this kind of state logic or bureaucratic logic taking hold, but the informal hierarchies are really the ones that matter at the end of the day. Yes, and I would say that the difference, at least one of the reasons for the difference, is that it really matters whether you acknowledge the need for the state or not. And in the cash transfer, there's this very explicit acknowledgement of not having enough state capacity. So people say things like, well, it would have been ideal if we could just have more officers, but that's not the case. So we try to, work through volunteers. Whereas in FISIP, it's very different, the overall narrative and discourse. So FISIP is always, or the malfunctioning of FISIP is usually blamed on the officers, on corruption and their inefficiencies and so on. So there's more this tendency of trying to replace the state with technology. Right, then thirdly, I would also say that in social policy, one other thing that happens is that, well, the kind of avenues or structures for interest representation can be created, what I would call linkages, or what is also in the literature sometimes called linkages. So actual ways for people to communicate their grievances and to make demands, because as much as people can organize maybe locally, you always need, of course, you also need this kind of connection and basically just knowing who is the addressee of my demands, right? And this is something that can happen in social policy or in social protection even. And what definitely happens and is observable in the cash transfer is that there's a growing awareness of the problems of the poor. But of course, what's less clear is whether this also contributes to people's organizational structures. In any case, there's this mutual knowledge that's certainly growing in the process. Yes, and then in FISIP, even though it's explicitly aimed to promote farming cooperatives, these, even though they do form in order to be able to receive the inputs, these really remain behind their potential in many ways, and behind their economic potential, behind their political potential, and so on. And this last finding now has brought me to what I initially introduced as my ongoing little research project. And that's the question really of how the state can provide structures for political representation in social policy. And to bring this out, I'm now, I know I have maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. I want to zoom in on these farming cooperatives and basically make a comparison between farming cooperatives in the Kaunda era, so under UNIP, and then farming cooperatives in the context of FISIP, because there's obvious differences, but I'm still in the process of unpacking what exactly these differences consist of. So in Kaunda, cooperatives were really, and this was all inspired by his humanism ideas, cooperatives seem to be so well able to combine economic aims with political aims. So they were also supposed to offer fora for democracy and also social aims and redistribution. As I said, Kaunda really wanted to bring development, especially also to the rural areas. How much he was then de facto connected to rural areas, that's a different question, but at least it was one of the expressed intentions. Yeah, sorry, I'm going through this rather briefly now, so not in order to not take up too much time. So there was this whole structure consisting of cooperatives and then the marketing board, and they really provided important markets and credit supply and everything to the smallholders, especially also because there was the Zambian Cooperative Federation, which linked the primary cooperatives to like a multi-tier structure that spanned the district, provincial, and national levels. But as so many things, also this structure was dismantled in the 80s and 90s. So even though today cooperatives are always at the center of attention, there's really not this support structure anymore. So they do form because they have to in order to be able to access FISIP. But the whole idea is really to use these cooperatives basically as the mediators between the state and the farmers. So the cooperatives now have the responsibility to make all these smallholders into successful business people. But the means by which they can do that are really limited, especially because the Zambian Cooperative Federation has been so underfunded ever since the end of Kaunda's reign. And of course, this was not only because of structural adjustment, but also because UNIP was very closely linked to the cooperative movement. So obviously with the new government, there was this interest in weakening the cooperatives. And so cooperatives really find themselves caught between pressure coming from two sides. So on the one hand, farmers are unhappy because cooperatives are not really supporting them very effectively. On the other hand, cooperatives also get the blame from the government when farmers, don't live up to what they are expected to do, namely transform themselves and the country's agricultural sector. But even though maybe the cooperatives are not there anymore for farmers to exercise voice effectively, because really offices have been closed and so on, there is at the same time this new interest in speaking to farmers, and there's all this research going on because of this, what's very popular nowadays, evidence-based policymaking. So you have all these researchers, myself included, going to the villages, talking to farmers. So apparently they are being somehow represented. But then if you look more closely, I think, well, one thing probably is that in research, obviously, this is always mediated by, well, the researchers at least. And then the other thing is that there's also quite a big, there are really big differences within the smallholder community. So just because you're a smallholder doesn't mean there aren't power imbalances and hierarchies even within, the same villages or the same community. And basically at the end of the day, it's the slightly more vocal and also the richer smallholders that end up being represented in policymaking, as I've also found from, tracing the reform of the electronic voucher. Yeah. All right. So I would say, by way of conclusion, I would say certainly we do see a bit of a return of the state within social policy. Although you might say, well, the neoliberal logic actually prevails. And as I've also carefully tried to argue, it's actually even further ingrained through social policy because it's being normalized and people just get used to it. And even social policy, which is supposed to be a cushion, is basically following this overall logic of austerity. But at the same time, I also see that there is some potential for incremental change, such as giving voice to formerly disconnected people and so on. And maybe then more on a meta level, I would always emphasize the need for studying the state as an outcome rather than a cause. And especially also what I would call maybe the space of possibilities within the state can actually act. And these are certainly an outcome of a mixture of ideological and material dimensions. And maybe more like a practical conclusion would be to really rebuild the material capacities at all levels of the state in order for social policy to be effective and also to be long-term and to be even able to follow like a long-term vision. All right, thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. We now move over to Michael Pesa-White.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, and thanks everybody for the time to participate in this. For some reason, I'm having a very unusual network challenge, so I hope there is no disruption for at least the period within which I speak. With your permission, let me share my screen. Just 1 minute. Okay, so I start this presentation basically by making reference to 2013 when Professor Nkandawiri, the late, was delivered the Agri-Fraser Memorial Lecture here at the University of Ghana. And the topic was beyond recovery. And in that lecture, a 3-day lecture, 3 things that stood out was his concern and caution for what he referred to as the Afro-euphoria rising out of what was referred to as African rising. And then also he made a point that the era of structural adjustments did not really produce the kind of growth that was expected. But ultimately, when African countries began the process of democratization in the 90s, there were some, sources as far as growth was concerned. And the third point he made, which actually leads to aspects of the presentation this afternoon, has to do with his call for social equality in the development processes in Africa. There have been conversations about democracy in Africa, democracy elsewhere, and the relationship between democracy and social policy. And so I start this conversation. The intent here is to basically throw out a number of things for reflection as a research in progress, and also for guiding the conversations that we have within the time within which we are doing this. And so I start by asking, what is the interplay between democracy and social policy in contemporary Ghana? And this question is important because Ghana in the early post-colonial era prioritized social policy very highly. It was seen as an instrument not only for economic growth, but also was seen as an instrument for building the new nation state, and also for ensuring political inclusion. And so health, education, housing, even with youthful population, pension systems and other things were of great priority to policymakers at the time. Things have changed between the early post-colonial era and now. And so the idea is to find out, now that we have some semblance of stable democracy, what is the interplay between that democracy and social policy in Ghana? And it's a way of also asking in what ways the democracy we have now is shaping the social policy reforms, largely because there have been a number of social policies on the reform agenda, especially from the 2000s onwards. And the reason this is important is because both democracy and social policy in many ways are aimed at promoting structural transformation and also improving the human condition. Yet the interfacing continues to ignite a lot of debate. And particularly so in the 1980s, when structural adjustment was introduced in African countries. The arguments at the time were that democracies were not well placed to promote the kind of economic stability and structural reforms that were needed to turn African economies around. And to that extent, the World Bank, the IMF, and a lot of the transnational actors appear to have supported authoritarian regimes, including military regimes, that were more willing to implement those policies. And across the continent, really, in the 80s, most of the countries that implemented structural adjustment programs did so under authoritarian government. Here in Ghana, it was within the period of the military rule under Jerry John Rawlings. And it was also within that period that it is after that period that the political space was opened up for democratization. Beyond that, there is also a certain argument that suggests that authoritarian forms of government were therefore much better placed to extract resources and provide public goods, in a sense, to be able to ensure distribution and impose short-term costs on the population, the kind of costs that, in the view of promoters of the structural adjustment programs, were necessary to introduce or to bring about some stability. But the inability of the reforms in the 80s to actually prioritize social policy, in fact, neglected social policy at the time, and the relative sources of similar reforms in other democracies, particularly in South America and India, has resulted in a certain rethinking of the interface between social policy and democracy, not only in Africa, but across the world. And by the late 1990s, social policy had returned to the development agenda. But previous studies, particularly that examined European welfare state development, particularly from the point of view of power resource, suggested that there was a significant relationship between democracy and social policy. The idea was that democracies often offer significant liberties and opportunities to citizens, be they workers or ordinary citizens, to mobilize and influence public policies in their particular direction, because candidates and political parties campaigning for or persuading people to consider them in elections are much more likely to play to the gallery or play to the desires and the wishes of the people. And there have been studies by Stevens, Coppin and Palmer, SPiA, and several others that showed a strong positive correlation between the development of what we call the welfare state associated with mostly European countries and social policy, largely because of the latitude democracies grants for people to mobilize and make demands on the states. Here, the central argument of all of this was that has been that states are compelled to take on an expanded role by providing social services funded by the state. I mean, education, healthcare, housing, and so on and so forth, as a way of making sure that they manage the complexities of a changing society. Now, the general hypothesis, therefore, was that the resurgence of democracy in African countries, and of course also in other jurisdictions across the world, provide a unique opportunity for social policies to return to the center of governance in African countries, because democratic institutions such as parliament, such as elections, and so on and so forth, invariably will offer citizens the opportunity to influence the allocation of social spending on poverty and inequality, and of course also on the general distribution and redistribution of resources. This argument has been related in some ways to the African context, where the analysis was that even though you may not have had the kind of social movements that were alluded to in the European literature, Africa's democratic process or democratization process itself was in part ignited by mass movements of people who were discontent with, one, the structural adjustment programs, and two, the authoritarian forms of government that were in place at the time. And so for the most part, this development in the region was seen as a major political change that has implications for the sustainability of democracy and the dividends as far as social policy is concerned. The mass movement of workers and ordinary citizens was seen as a major explanatory factor in Africa's return to democracy. And this can be seen in the works of Carroll, Jima Bwedi, and so many others who credited mass movements, civil society organizations, workers' organizations, labor unions for the emergence of Africa's democracies. Civil society then became a major unit of analysis, particularly in the 1990s, for the role it was perceived to have played, and became a buzzword being studied actively. So that while some scholars view it as a type of space where people form organizations and use the numbers or the resources that are available to their numbers to engage the state, others argue that it's an arena of politics of self-organizing groups and movements who are relatively autonomous from the state and try to articulate their values or create spaces for engaging the state in the issues that affect their livelihood and their lives. So with this context, what this particular study seeks to do is to basically revisit.
It's okay, I am listening to a lecture, but it's fine. Not urgent.
It's basically to revisit this conversation about the nexus or the linkages between democracy and social policy, particularly in the African context. There have been quite a number of studies about social policy in Africa. There have been a lot of studies about social policy in Africa, democracy in Africa, but there isn't as big a literature on particularly social policy and democracy in terms of their interfacing as compared to other parts of the world. Even though African democracies are almost, perhaps, not perhaps actually, they are over 30 years now. I mean, starting with Ghana and others are getting to 30 years, and so many others that have gone even before Ghana, like Benin and others. In this particular study, the idea is to look at 3 major social policy programs that have witnessed reform between 2004 and 2017 in Ghana. One is the health financing reform. The other is the pension or old age income security reform. And then the more recent reform, which is the senior higher education financing reform. And I briefly take them in turn just to show, or just to discuss the context of democracy within which they emerge. Now, in 2004, the government initiated the process to reform the Ghanaian healthcare system. What was before was introduced in the era of structural adjustment, and it was essentially a cash and carry health financing model. Individuals were expected to go to health facilities and pay out of pocket. And with the levels of poverty and the circumstances, the abject poverty that was also created by the structural adjustment programs, it was quite a devastating period for a lot of people. And studies have shown that hospital utilization within that period was very low, as many people took on to self-medication, others took on to unscientific ways of treating their illnesses. And so by 2000, when competitive politics appeared to have been gaining ground in Ghana's democratic dispensation, reform of healthcare became one of the key themes. And already from 1996, political parties started articulating their views on the cash and carry. So clearly democracy opened a window for this to become a public discourse, something that hitherto wasn't the case. And among the 2 major parties, even though the NDC was in power, it also promised to abolish cash and carry ahead of the 1996 elections. It won the 1996 elections, it never did. Towards the 2000 election, the NPP was a bit more aggressive in promising to abolish cash and carry. And the NPP won the elections. Now, in the 3-year period, 4-year period of the NPP, it waited until the next election cycle, which was 2004, before placing the issue of health reform firmly on the policy agenda. In the end, it was successful in moving the health financing policy of cash and carry to a national health insurance program that is based on premium by formal sector workers, deductions from payroll by formal sector workers, premium by those who work in the informal sector, tax financing, and other means of financing. Now, this arrangement invariably was intended to solve the problems associated with cash and carry and provide a much more transformative arrangement for health provision in Ghana. But what it has done, and what exists now, is that it has created a certain stratification as far as health financing and access to healthcare is concerned. So there is a tax finance and premium-based national health insurance that is largely and mostly accessed by people who hold the NHIA cards and access the services in public health facilities and a few other accredited institutions. Most of the individuals who depend on this, or most of the citizens who depend on this, are largely those who may not or are not in a position to afford quality care from private hospitals, or are not working in any formal sector employment, and therefore they are not covered by private insurance. And so that's the national health insurance becomes that in theory, which was available for everybody, but in practice, only few people access it because of the poor nature of care that is offered in those spaces. Then you have the private health insurance, which then provides care mostly in private hospitals, in some public hospitals also. But this is something that is subscribed to mostly by individuals who are lucky to be employed in the formal sector. And therefore, the employer subscribes and covers the employees. And so employees, and in some cases, their families who have health concerns are able to access relatively quality healthcare in public or private facilities and paid for through those insurance programs. Then you have the third layer, which is more like the return of out-of-pocket payments that is offered in private health facilities. And many of them are known for very high quality health services and are often assessed by the wealthy and the most affluent in society. So in an attempt to reform the cash and carry and introduce a health policy that is more, one that has more human face and provides access and affordability to Ghanaians, that pulls resources and also pull risk, we ended up with a health structure that virtually has classified, that has a certain classification that pushes people into different brackets depending on their income level, or depending on where they work, or depending on whether they have the means to pay. In 2008, also, ahead of the presidential and the parliamentary elections, the government took a decision following agitation by workers to initiate consultations for reforms of the pension system. The pension system that was before was a single pillar social insurance model run by the National Social Insurance, and National, sorry, SNIT, which is Social Insurance and Social Insurance. Anyway, it's the acronym is SNIT. I think I just mixed up the full distance. Now, that used to be a single pillar, and the agitation by workers at the time was that the management of their funds or workers' contributions was such that workers were not getting what is due them when they eventually retire or when they are on pension. And so they wanted a reform that could bring some benefit adequacy and also bring some transparency and a better management and more judicious use of the pension funds. Unfortunately, that agitation opened a window of opportunity for government to basically reform the pension plan on the basis of some of the neoliberal logics that were still lurking in the wings. Out of the single pillar social insurance scheme, now Ghana has a 3-tier pension scheme that retain the social insurance plan, but we've reduced contributions and created 2 additional pillars. The second pillar being a private, run by private entities, and has a percentage of workers' contribution going into it, and that is invariably managed purely on private sector principles or on market principles. And that is supposed to be complementary to individuals who are already saving in the first tier, which is the social insurance model. Of course, it's also available to those who are in the informal sector, at least in theory. Then the third tier, by design, was to target individuals who are working in the informal sector. And again, it is purely voluntary. It is not mandatory at all, compared to the social insurance, which is mandatory and mandatory for formal sector workers. So you have the second and the third tier that opens window of opportunity for those in the informal sector, but they are not mandatory, they are voluntary. So that the problem of myopia that is often associated with why governments take active interest in making sure that there is a certain compulsion in saving towards retirement is absent for the large majority of people who actually participate in economic activities in the informal sector. And that has implications for social equity and also for the security, the income security of the large majority of the population going into the future. And so workers in the informal sector as I indicated, are often asked by the provisions of the law to take advantage of tax incentives to save with either the second or the third tier on their own. And what the pension system has left in its wake is that old age income security is commodified, just like healthcare, and available compulsory for educating working class in the formal sector, but on voluntary basis for the majority in the informal labor force. Then the final one has to do with the final social policy that has witnessed reform, has to do with the free senior higher education policy, which began in 2017. This is something that has been at the center of political debates and campaigns since 2008. By 2016, it became probably the most dominant issue in the electioneering campaign, with the new Patriotic Party promising that when elected, it will implement free senior higher education for all Ghanaians who qualify to go to senior high school. And the NDC claiming that the free senior high school program was not something that Ghana was ready for because of lack of space, because of lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of personnel, and so on and so forth. And so it was going to invest more in those areas and eventually also roll out a free education. So fundamentally, the idea of free was not in dispute. It's a question of whether it should be done now or it should be done later. And I think that is where the two parties essentially disagreed. So upon winning the election in 2016, September 2017, the government rolled out free education and asked that parents pay nothing whatsoever, including payments that were made by PTAs were all abolished, so that kids who qualified to go to school could just pack their things and go to school. Unfortunately, these particular service or these particular services provided by private schools in the senior high category were not included. So the private senior high schools were not included. And so in the distribution and placement of students, they were actually denied the space to have students, except if parents opt on their own volition to take their kids to private school. What it meant was that even though government was, the state was financing senior high education, now in public schools, senior high education was still available as a commodity in the private schools. And so anybody can opt for that. And in fact, anybody who followed the news in Ghana or the debates in Ghana at the time, the private schools were quite upset because people thought that their investments were basically going down the drain because by government policy, they have been denied of the ability to have students around their schools. And that also had implications for teachers and other workers who were working in those private schools. In the first year, this was a great concern. By the second year, third year and into now, we hardly hear any noise or any complaint from the private schools. And some of our preliminary investigations or research seems to suggest that because of the poor quality and the problems associated with the implementation of the free senior high school, many parents are gradually beginning to move their kids from the public school system and taking them to private schools where they will have the opportunity to at least be able to influence what some of those private providers are offering. And that is something that is being referred to by some as privatization through the back door. As the private schools become more and more popular and are also seen to offer more quality of the senior higher education, it does appear that if nothing is done to improve the quality in the public schools, privatized senior high school will become the norm without necessarily being deliberate policy of government. And so here I conclude with a few observations. One is that democracy and democratic institutions, especially elections, are shaping social policy reform agenda, but substantive impact of democracy on social policy reforms appear to be very minimal. The reforms we have seen so far have not been far-reaching. Significant numbers of the population either continue to be excluded or in some cases, many of these services remain significantly commodified, and access is based on whatever arrangements the reforms actually came with. We also see that beyond the agenda, the substantive reforms continue to reflect the neoliberal logic, even though most of these reforms were intended to address the human cost and the social cost that were associated with neoliberal policies to a very large extent. The very logic of those neoliberal policies remain at the foreground of all the reforms that have taken place, both in education, in healthcare, and of course, also in pensions as well. And then, of course, observations from social policy reform in Ghana also raise questions about the capacity of reform-minded actors to influence the policy process. It does appear that those who agitate for reform in policy areas get excited when the reform agenda is set. But beyond the agenda, the process where all the deliberations, the negotiations, the coalition building, and so on and so forth happens, appears to be left solely to elected politicians and bureaucrats who eventually engineer the reform in the direction that may not necessarily bring about social equity and equality. And finally, from the final observation from this is that Ghana's recent experience with social policy since the 2000s have largely been cosmetic and symbolic, lacking the necessary radical transformational changes to protect and enhance the collective well-being of the people, particularly in the tradition of Nkandiwe's formulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Very quickly, let's move on to Dennis. Mike, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Good morning, and thank you very much, or good afternoon, and thank you very much, Jimmy. It is indeed a pleasure to be among such distinguished panelists.
Dennis, 20 minutes.
Yep. Okay. And other participants at the second plenary session on democracy, state building, and social policy at the 2021 Social Policy in Africa Conference in honor of Thandika Mkandiwere. It was a privilege to have met Thandika in Pretoria for the first time at the inaugural 2017 Social Policy Conference in Africa. We talked as if we had known each other for several years. Thandika was indeed a great scholar, and judging from the several exchanges we've had on the lighter side, he was also a great comedic storyteller. I listened with deep interest as he talked about his time in exile in South America. And Mr. Chairman, I could not have ignored this opportunity to be a part of this special conference, remembering one of Africa's finest thinkers in the past 100 years. Mr. Chairman, the keynote address by Professor Jayanti Ghosh and the inaugural Thandika Memorial lecture by Professor Cheru, as well as the contributions of my fellow panelists here this morning on social policy and state formation and democracy and social policy, have raised a particular issue that I will also address, and that is the role of the state in what Thandika identified as transformative social protection, social policy. My presentation, as stated in the program, is entitled Fresh Vistas for Africa's Development in the New Multipolar World Order, but it is focused really on West Africa's development in the new multipolarity. The ideas for the presentation were formulated from my recent book entitled Caribbean Development in the New Multipolar World Order, that explored the issue of development in the Caribbean community in the current period of political and economic realignment Today, I would like to address two main points in the discussion on fresh vistas for Africa's development in the new multipolar world order. One, the first point is that the unipolar global order, which the US aspired to construct, that is over, and it's being replaced by a new multipolar world order that is more favorable to a developmental state. Second, the poor economic social indicators in ECOWAS justify the economic alignment with non-traditional forces such as China based on state-led market approaches to development. Now let us explore some points onto the first heading, the first issue that I raised. In the new multipolar world order, the US, European Union, China, and Russia share power and compete and cooperate for resources, and it is forging major political and economic realignment in international politics and economics. The collapse of the US-led globalization project is as significant as was the disintegration of the former Soviet Union and Eastern European communism, but the former has not been as dramatic and does not receive the same amount of coverage as the latter. A bipolar world characterized by two superpowers, the US and Soviet Union, existed before the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the emergence of a unipolar globe under the sole hegemony of the US. But the collapse of the globalization project is gradual, forging a new multipolar world order characterized by state market policies, state-led market policies, rather than a blind free market fundamentalism. Tandika observed, although many economists criticized the neoliberal model and pointed out that it was wrong for Europe and the US, the IMF insists it is good for Africa and still goes around in Africa imposing it. It is a well-known fact, however, that the economic policy of neoliberal globalization was associated with an unprecedented economic downturn in Africa. Tandika observed that the collapse of the African economies, quote, in the main period of structural adjustment was deeper and lasted longer than the Great American Depression, end quote. He noted that, quote, we call the structural adjustment period the last decades, end quote. But in his view, that phrase does not capture, quote, the economic decline of that period. Instead, we should be calling it the Great African Depression, end quote, and continue to study its lasting effects on African economies today and in the future. Mr. Chairman, we identified 5 essential features of the new multipolar world order. For the first feature, we argue that it is founded on 4 major powers. 1, the US, characterized by a retreat from globalism, increasing protectionism, state-led recovery, and the desire to divide the world into autocratic and democratic states. 2, European bloc imperialism, characterized by a superimposed state on European countries and manifested through the European Commission's Global Europe policy, which is best understood as a grand strategy to increase and maintain Europe's economic and political power and leverage around the world. Now, we should note that the EU is not a country, but it behaves like a country. And third, the increasing power of China manifested through its Belt and Road Initiative and Made in China 2025 program, And 4, the restoration of Russia as an international power, evidenced by Russia's expanding role and world influence, including claims such as Russia electing a president of the United States. The second feature of the new multipolar world order is that it is a world order and not a global order, because no single power is seeking to spread its unique version of economics and politics to all other countries, as was the case under neoliberal globalization. The third feature of the new multipolar world order is that it is based on power sharing, cooperation, and competition on the world stage. The fourth feature is that it is based on different versions of state-led market approaches to economic development. And the fifth feature I've identified is that it entails the realignment of political and economic relations around the world, as is evident in Latin America, the Caribbean, and African countries. Economic realignment is taking place in Africa, including ECOWAS, which is reflected by the fact that these states are engaging non-traditional sources of finance, particularly from China, for infrastructure and other economic development projects. Africa has negotiated most of its non-traditional funding from China in the following areas: 52.8% for transport, shipping, and ports, 17.6% for energy and power, 14.3% for real estate, including industrial, commercial, and residential real estate, and 7.7% in mining. Benin, Cabo Verde, the Gambia, Ghana, etc., have all negotiated with China for funding for various economic development projects totaling billions of dollars. Africa's negotiated projects range from construction of ECOWAS headquarters, estimated at 32 million, to the 20 billion loan over a 20-year period in exchange for concessions on Guinean bauxite. But the Guinean loan is particularly interesting because it guarantees, among other things, an aluminum refinery, bauxite mine, and other bauxite projects. And the revenue from these projects would then serve to reimburse China for the loan. Undoubtedly, the ECOWAS was already realigning their economies with non-traditional sources of finance. But the problem is that they are going it alone, which can expose them to many problems critics have identified. Tandika observed, quote, "China has a plan for Africa, but Africa has no plan for China. It's vital that Africa begins to realize that we can't continue negotiating with China one by one and as small nations. We should be able to find ways to collectively negotiate with China on a number of things," end quote. The ECOWAS must formulate a West African approach to non-traditional sources of finance to derive the greatest benefits for the region and to steer past the possible pitfalls of individual countries taking on China all by themselves. Mr. Chairman, the second main point for discussion is that after centuries of doing business with Europe and America, the poor economic and social indicators in the ECOWAS justified economic realignment in the region with non-traditional forces such as China. Here we look at the structure and distribution of ECOWAS economy and selected indicators. Now, the structure of exports. Together with fuels, the major export products are the extractive industries, 75% of exports, excluding re-exports, 73% of which is provided by Nigeria. cocoa and cocoa food preparation, 5%, precious stones, 3%, and secondarily cotton, edible fruit, rubber, plastic, wood and wood products, fish, shellfish, etc., just 1%. Clearly, the ECOWAS are merely selling raw materials, while Tandika insisted that Africa needs more intercontinental trade in manufactured commodities, which will be facilitated by building Africa's transportation infrastructure that China is helping to provide. And this is a reason why he was favorable to Chinese investments in infrastructure in West Africa, in Africa. Now, what about the destination of the exports? The ECOWAS reported in 2017 that the community exported primarily to the Americas and Europe, 68%, 40% with the Americas, 34% of which to North America. And of that, the North American Free Trade Area comprised 24%. Now, Europe represents 28%, 23% of which is with the EU. South-South trade involving Asian countries and those of Oceania captured 16%, and the Near and Middle East accounted for 0.3%. The two biggest exporters were Nigeria and Ivory Coast, which together provided 87% of ECOWAS exports, with Nigeria representing 77% and Ivory Coast 10%. Ghana and Senegal accounted for approximately 6% and 4% respectively. 4% and 2% respectively, bringing a total of 6%. Now, it shows that the top 10, in terms of imports, the top 10 classes of ECOWAS imports were fuels, then motor vehicles, tractors, cycles, and other vehicles, machinery, mechanical appliances, and boilers, etc. But these imports, we have fuels representing 24% of the imports, and Nigeria and Ghana account for 59% of ECOWAS imports, 41% and 18% respectively. And the ECOWAS states that comprise the West African Economic and Monetary Union accounted for 36% of the imports. The remaining countries, 5 countries, Cape Verde, the Gambia, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone accounted for only 5%. Now, we've noticed that the annual GDP was 678 million, a decline, this is for last year, for 2020, a decline on average of 2% in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The decline was below the average GDP rate of 3.5% achieved before 2020. GDP per capita was 1,730 in 2020, and total debt was 285 million, or 41% of GDP. Meanwhile, Nigeria was ECOWAS and Africa's largest economy by GDP, and is forecast to exit recession in 21, but its growth will be slower than other sub-Saharan African states at 2.3%. Now, according to Tandika, many countries in Africa have not fully recovered, have yet to reach their per capita income of the 70s. And he said, in fact, all we can say is that maybe at least we've gone back to the per capita income of the 70s. In August 2021, Ghana had the fastest growing economy in West Africa, which is forecast to register about 4% real GDP growth in 2021. Robert Tandika observed, however, quote, "Our leaders get happy with 3 or 4% growth, totally oblivious to the possibilities suggested by Asian countries. The levels of growth that Africa can achieve can easily be over 10%, because new technologies are highly productive and permit high levels of surplus. That is particularly what could explain the Chinese miracle. The savings ratio that countries can afford today without starving people to death were impossible under the technologies in use during Britain's industrial development. So after squeezing national labor, including child labor and colonial labor, they could 1 to 2% growth. Ethiopia's been doing 10% for the last 10 years. So it's possible to grow by 10% in Africa. Now, but when we look at the poverty and inequality in ECOWAS, we noticed that the Oxfam reported that there is quite a lot of inequality, even though there is some growth, there is considerable growth, economic growth in several of the countries. There is unprecedented inequality. Oxfam claims that for most countries, the benefits of this growth went to a tiny few. Inequality has reached extreme levels in the region. The rich have grown richer while the poor have become poorer. The region has also the least public care coverage and the least populations with access to water and decent education. West Africa has the greatest number of countries with more than 30% of the population living on less than $1.90 a day. And that the top 1%, West Africans, own more than everyone else combined in the region. The poverty rate in ECOWAS was estimated at 40% of the worldwide poverty rate in 2019. Meanwhile, 5 of Nigeria's richest men have a combined wealth of 29.9 billion, more than the country's entire national budget for 2017, while about 60% of Nigerians live on less than $1.25 a day. So here we see that in the midst of this growth, which leaders are getting excited about, which Thandika claims no sense to get excited about because it's not as high as 10%. But the few that get rich in the process get so rich that they're so way far away from the rest of the people. Now, so the question is, in this new multipolar order, I'm saying that Africa, ECOWAS has the opportunity to pursue a state-led sort of approach, realignment of the economies, so that they can then achieve what Thandika says, the sort of optimism that Africa must be given the space or capture the space to think its own way out of its predicament. But I'm arguing that thinking the way out of the predicament will include broaching the new multipolar world order in such a way that they can create more state-led approaches to social development, linking the social development policies with this whole question of economic development, because the people cannot produce if they're not healthy. So no sense you try to make them promote economic growth when they're unhealthy. You got to be healthy first to work and to produce. And so I think that in the same way that Thandika was optimistic about the future for Africa, I'm very much optimistic for the future for West Africa, but they need to take some deliberate steps to in the realignment, economic realignment. And mind you, economic realignment doesn't mean that you're breaking with Europe. It's not like the argument that was advanced before with Samir Amin and others, but breaking. It's not making the break. It's about how to leverage the current situation where we have multiple powers while promoting multiple powers that are using their states to enhance their people's social and economic development, how to do the same thing or repeat the same thing in Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dennis. And thanks to our three panelists for very rich, very incisive, and very intriguing discussion. We'll go to our, we have just about, I think we can bridge the break by about 2 minutes, so we still have about 8 minutes more. There's a question from Kaja to Anna, and I think Anna had already referred the question to you. And then a question from Kate to Anna and Mike, which says, thank you for a brilliant panel. My question is for the two panelists. Your presentation definitely exposed the limitation of social policy reform, but it didn't address the role of the invisible partners in the design and execution of this reform. Big capital, big tech, agribusiness, insurance corporation, and international health and education companies are all central lobbyists, if not players, in the design of social policy reforms. To paraphrase Tandika, big capital has a plan for Africa's social policy. The African social policy activists have a plan for big capital. Could you reflect on the role interference of PPPs and other influences of international private firms and private interest in the design of your specific social policy reforms? I don't know who wants to go first, Anna or Michael. By the way, you can follow the questions and the comments on the Q&A channel.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. Maybe I can start with the first question that was raised by Katja. Thank you very much for this question. Now, luckily, this format gave me a little bit of time to think about this. Yeah, well, I mean, the answer that comes to my mind first is this really would have been also very interesting. I think, in particular, when it is about tracing, maybe also the way in which certain services or schemes are being explained and justified over time. So clearly there maybe we might have seen a little bit more continuity. I agree. Maybe the reason, and maybe just on a side note, it's very unclear really whether FISIP even is social protection. So it was included in the National Social Protection Policy in 2014. But I've actually just checked again with the current budget that was just, I mean, the budget for 2022 that was just announced a couple of weeks ago, lists FISIP under economic policies, right, and not under social protection. So I think the boundary there is not very clear. And I also found that FISIP is quite even if we say it's social protection, it's more of an untypical social protection, because it, well, doesn't really target the poorest parts of the population. Yeah, but I think maybe the main reason why I wanted to look at social protection was that I found it was so controversial at the time when I was first living and working in Zambia. So there were all these changes. The cash transfer was still growing considerably, and FISIP was in the news all the time. So I felt if I wanted to study the kind of the renegotiation of the state, this clearly was a field where a lot of negotiation was going on, whilst maybe in education or health, perhaps. I mean, I haven't studied those fields, but I'm just assuming that maybe they are a little bit less controversial. So maybe it would have been slightly less fruitful for me, but that's just a hunch. But I think it's a good point that you're raising there, to maybe also, think what this could perhaps look like, and if you looked at other types of social policies. Yeah, and then on the question raised by Kate Marr, thank you for that as well. Well, I think the most obvious answer is, the fertilizer industry in the case of FISIP. So clearly there is also this, I mean, I haven't really, to be honest, I haven't really traced the connections. Maybe this is something I should do a little bit more, you know, who exactly pulls the strings, but I know that there is, of course, a lot of interest in keeping farmers dependent on chemical fertilizer, which, I mean, that's a whole other debate, even though I'm quite sympathetic to FISIP for many reasons. Of course, the fact that it makes farmers so dependent on continuously ruining their soils is really a problem. And that's also something that, for instance, the Green Revolution for Africa initiative, you know, I think is not really taking into account sufficiently. So maybe I'll end there for the time being.
All right, Michael, can I draw your attention to Kate's question or comment?
Yes.
You want to respond?
Absolutely. Just briefly. I mean, Kate, thank you very much for the question, and I like your use of the word invisible partners, and that's essentially is part of the issue I was raising in the observation section of my presentation, which is that local actors or domestic actors need to look beyond just setting the agenda, especially those who are interested in genuine reforms, because it does appear when you look at the policy design of many of these reforms, ultimately, it does appear that they were really not designed to address the specific challenges of human well-being, but invariably were designed to serve the interests of particular actors or particular interests that may have been pushing it from an angle that is not obviously visible to the ordinary observers. And so what is required is for reform-minded individual, social policy reform-minded individual, to not only begin the process and see the agenda being set like that, as it was in the case of, let's say, health and pensions, and in fact also in the education policy in Ghana, but to be interested in every single step along the policy value chain from the beginning to the end. That is the only way some of these invisible partners and the particular interest they intend to serve can be checked and contained or curtailed within the policy process. Thank you.
Dennis, on the Q&A channel, there's a comment for you from Maria. And it's, which is the role of African regions in this new multipolar world order? What do you think is important to study and understand when looking at regions in the multipolar world order? And then I will draw Anna's attention to Andrew's comment question as well. You know, but over to you, Dennis. 1 minute.
The regions, well, the regions can approach the forces in the same way like we in the Caribbean, what we did during the Cold War. We were able to play both sides to our benefit. So if you want to do it as a region, that's how we are suggesting that you might be able to negotiate with the four powers that be to your benefit. But the big difference now, I think, is that because they're not each carrying, they each not necessarily want you to become like them, they're negotiating with you in their own self-interest, and you have to, I think, as a region, strengthen yourself in, I think you're stronger negotiating as a region in your self-interest, in your regional self-interest, compared with if you go as a single country. So I've noticed here too that in the chat there were some other questions, but I leave it to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Because of the time constraint, I'll ask Anna, do you want to respond to Andrew's question and comment? Or is this something you want to take up with him at a later stage?
How to make a quick choice. Let me maybe say 2 sentences on this.
Okay, all right.
So I think it's I mean, that's something you raised yesterday. So I think it really shows the poor people have no lobby, right? And even though I said, you know, even with the death of the cooperative movement and so on, it has become more difficult for farmers to exercise voice. There is this certain group of farmers that have really good connections and they make a lot of noise when something doesn't go right. I think that's one thing. And the other is also that maybe, but that's just a speculation, maybe, you know, these farming inputs, they have a much longer history, and they, I think in many, I mean, amongst many people that I have talked to at least, they seem to be much more understood and much more legitimate. So it's clear you need to invest in food production in times of crisis. So I think the cash transfer is also still kind of building this, this awareness, and then ultimately also this demand amongst the people. And then, I mean, there was also a big corruption scandal in, I think it was 2018. That's when some of the main donors also froze some of their money. So that might have had to do with the, with the drop. But we can, of course, discuss this further at any point.
All right. I apologize to all the other participants who may be posing, you know, questions, just so that we bring the what do you call it, the session to an end. We have just about 11 minutes before the beginning of the next session. But let me just again thank Anna, Michael, and Dennis for very important and, you know, very interesting, what do you call it, contributions to the debates and the panel. I won't do any intervention. We don't have the time, you know. But just to remind everybody that the next session, the special GetSPA plenary session starts at 4:30. And it's what do you call it? It's an introduction to the project with discussion from Charles Abugre, Newman Tekwa, Mena Akwa Edo. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Hi, George.
Hi, good
Hi.
afternoon. Yeah,
Okay, so
we still have 5 minutes left, I guess, to
yeah,
start.
I just do you want me to still display the banner?
Why not?
The comfort break banner.
Yeah. Well, it's only 5 minutes left, Jimmy. I think you should be okay. But good afternoon, everyone. Hi, good to see you.
I managed to get in.
I know, Charles. This is a miracle. As they say in Lagos, miracle.
But I miss Jayati and Fantu. So somebody has to share the
I'm really
presentation.
sad. You should ask Jimmy to share the recordings. Those were very good sessions.
Yeah, I know they would be. So, but I did get into a couple of good sessions, so I am not complaining too much.
They're on YouTube.
They're on YouTube. Okay, that's fantastic.
The recording is.
Nanepia doesn't have something. She says she doesn't have audio or video permission.
Where is she?
She probably is trying to get into it through the link you sent to us.
Okay, all right.
The link in the program. Whereas I've come now as
no. It's okay. I've just promoted her to panelist.
Okay, fantastic.
So she should be there now.
Okay.
Yes, I am. I do remember that we were given different links as panelists. Forgive me for that. Yeah. Thank you for promoting me.
Okay.
I'm using my Bluetooth, so is the audio clear enough, Georgie?
Yes, it is. It's very clear.
Thank you.
As clear as your photo in your living room.
I tried to do the blurred thing, but it doesn't work very well for me. I kind of disappear, so I'm just going to.